Hello, and welcome to the Device Files Commercialization Confidential with me, Blythe Karow from the Karow Advisory Group. Commercialization Confidential is a podcast focused on what it really takes to go from written commercialization to real world traction. And so we're talking real stories, real challenges, and the top 5 takeaways you can actually use from CEOs and commercial leaders who have experience launching medical devices, wearables, or digital therapeutics firsthand. In this episode, I'm very excited to welcome Gary Warren, who I met through Virginia Bio. Gary does a lot with medical devices around Virginia Bio, but he's also the founder and former CEO of IV Watch. So thank you for joining me, Gary.
Thank you for
Yeah.
having me.
Can you tell me a little bit about what IV Watch is and what you guys do?
Sure. Pretty simple concept, very complex implementation, though. We have a small sensor that goes on next to an IV site. If you've ever had an IV before, you always wonder, how did you get that catheter or that needle in the vein? Well, sometimes they don't. And the fluids that they're trying to inject into your vein end up going into the tissue. Some of them are very caustic, and people have limb amputations, skin necrosis, all kinds of
Don't tell me
complications.
that because I have literally seen it twice go wrong on my father where stuff swelled up in his arm.
Okay,
So
yeah.
he recovered fine.
Yeah. Yeah, it depends on
Yeah.
the drug usually, but some of the drugs like vasopressors are now, the way the hospital budgets and stuff are now, they're trying to cut costs, and it's easier to put in a very inexpensive peripheral IV as opposed to those very invasive PICC lines and stuff. My father actually died from an infection from one of these invasive lines
Goodness.
himself. So yeah, that's what we do. We have a patient monitor. I have
Okay. Yeah.
and it mounts on the IV pole, and then we have these sensors, and these sensors sell for anywhere from $30 to $40, and I have one on my
Okay.
hand.
Nice.
And you can see how
Yeah.
small they are. It's funny, this is what we started with. It's got
Wow.
rattles, but we'll talk about that hopefully a little later, how we got that through the hospital to get data, get it into market, and commercialize it.
Where specifically did you start trying to sell your product? Who was your customer and where?
So, we are very fortunate. Cincinnati Children's Hospital had reached they're the highest ranked children's hospital in the US, had reached out to the previous group before IV Watch was incorporated and said, "If you move your clinical work here, we will pay for
Wow.
it." And if you've been in medical devices, that's millions of dollars worth
And
of
why did
value.
they
It's
say
not the
that?
money, it's because they had a
Okay.
problem. So, we were basically brought in to solve a problem with the rattly thing that I just
Okay.
showed you. And those rattly things with the AA batteries actually got installed on patients so we could collect data. And that so the commercialization project per se started on day one of the company by having a great partner that have now formed into great, friendships and relationships with people, but to help us through with, this is what we need. This is what we need. And so there were a lot of iterations that happened with sensor designs and various things. And so the commercialization started the day after, or the day that the company became an LLC. And, my background is engineering. So I worked at NASA for about 14 years. So I had to put my engineering hat back on and figure out all the things that didn't really work right. I built a computing cluster in my living room that winter, and my wife was not happy because I was heating the house from 32 node computing cluster trying to figure out the problems with this med device.
Okay, so there was some sort of LLC or C corp or something that was doing the SBI work before.
Yeah, the other was. It wasn't called IV Watch. They set it on a shelf.
Got it.
So if you're really an entrepreneur and you want to really find out what's needed in hospitals, just go visit people getting SBIRs and find out what's on the shelf.
That's a good recommendation. I like it. Okay. So Gary very kindly, when I asked for 5 takeaways, gave me a couple more that I could pick from. And so I'm going to go through and pick the ones that I think are the most fun to talk about and haven't been totally covered in some other podcast conversations that we've been having. So let's start with paid versus real KOLs. What did you mean by that?
Well, a lot of times you need a key opinion leader, right? And they'll work at a major hospital or institution, but the hospital or institution has really no interest. They don't have a problem, right? Their business model of doing consulting work is to help startup companies. But when you're done with that, there's no place to go because the hospital wasn't
Mm,
behind it. At Cincinnati, we didn't pay them any money per se, but they had a whole, from the CEO on down. When the CEO came to an interventional radiologist and they had a couple amputations and they said, we have to stop this problem. So I flew up there because you have the question all the time when you do a medical device, who pays, right? And who's going to pay
exactly.
for this? So, sometimes the ROI is built into the product. Soon a paid KOL, somebody that wants to be part of a movement and really solve a problem versus somebody that's just doing consulting work. And it's not to discredit one or the other,
You need them at
but
different
the one,
times.
if you're, yeah. And hopefully we'll get time to talk about post-market work and stuff that you have to do as well. But then you can kind of start bringing in other KOLs. But those initial KOLs, like I said, if I could bring in more than, a few that I had, that would have been the one big thing I would have done because they're just very passionate about it. And they will write papers. You don't have to pay them to write papers. And you get that clinical evidence that you need for post-market.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. If you could just tell me, is it meant for specifically the ER? Did you start in certain departments or specific areas of pain?
Well, I've done both, where you go into a hospital with a great big install of, 150 patient monitors. That never really works out too well because it gets out of control really
Right.
quick. The way we started is we started in one department at Cincinnati. You get all the bugs worked out, you have to get in the protocol and get the workflow changed. And now that customer, as of today, I mean, they buy an incredible amount. It became a standard of care across many different departments from ICU to, the PICU to just various other areas, NICU. But it's not something you can wake up one day and say, we're hospital
Right,
wide.
right.
It doesn't really
So
work
which
that
department
way.
did you start in?
The pediatric intensive care
Okay. And
unit.
did you
And then the other units that
sorry.
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, so when you went on to other hospitals, did you also start out in pediatric, or did you work with the hospital to identify a place to start?
Yeah, you have to have a clinical champion. So sometimes you don't get to choose. But generally speaking, we go where the high risk IVs
Okay,
are.
and where are those?
So if they're infusing
Which
mhm.
ones are those? Which departments?
So it may be an infusion center in the United Kingdom, an infusion center. They have, like the one thing they had a big problem with when we started working with them and is south of London was iron infusates. So if you get iron leaking outside of your IV, you end up with a permanent
Oh,
tattoo. And yeah, and the number one users of iron infusates are usually young women and, when they're having kids. And, so then all of a sudden we're disfiguring them with their arms getting all tattooed up
goodness.
and it doesn't come out.
Wow.
So we started an infusion center there, but that gentleman there, Andrew Barton, he's internationally known and he said, we got to solve this problem. So it's kind of a combination of high risk infusates and where you can find really strong clinical champions or
Well, that makes sense.
KOLs.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah. And a side note, I will tell you, in that infusion center, they used to have 2 to 3 iron extravasations or infiltrations a week, and they haven't had any in 3 years
Well,
now.
that's an excellent outcome. That's great.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, I see here, create a movement, not just a product.
You can't solve a problem with just a piece of technology.
Okay.
You got it's there's a whole package of things you got to do. And getting people excited about solving the problem, education may involve products outside of your product, but it's kind of like looking, movement. A movement is where you don't have to pay people to do things, right? And it involves it involves multiple products and combinations of things to stop a problem. But our goal is to stop the problem, not just sell
So
products.
what's the movement you created?
Oh, IV
Okay.
safety. I think, there's a movement now around IV safety, whereas, 5 years ago, Do you remember the pandemic and how they were putting IV pumps outside the room and piping them in inside
I
the
do not
room?
remember that specifically about the pandemic. I do remember the pandemic, but not that specifically.
Yeah, a lot of people don't remember it now. I do. That was a big hit on revenue. The pandemic, they were putting IV pumps outside the room because they didn't want to have to keep using PPE to go into the room, putting it on and off because there wasn't that much of it
I see, yeah, that
available.
makes sense.
But there was nobody in the room to watch if the IV was going bad
Yeah,
or not.
yeah,
And so, those kind of situations we can really help
that
out
makes
with.
sense. So I see 1 or 2 things here related to supply chain. What around supply chain do you think can really make or break commercialization?
Cost of goods
Okay,
sold. I mean, when you're in medical devices, you have to be a margin hound. And because there's this fallacy out there, especially with investors, I think that, don't invest typically with med devices, that you can just outsource things. And so, if I want to buy one patient monitor, I can go to Acme Patient Monitors and buy a patient monitor. And it doesn't quite work that way because you have to worry about things called MOQs, which are minimum order quantities, and the timing of everything, the cost of everything. And since the pandemic, MOQs have been getting higher and higher and higher. And so, you end up having to buy 250,000 LEDs and you may only need
mm,
50,000.
yeah,
And so you have to work very closely with vendors. I think one of the things we did right is a lot of the high cost manufacturing, which is labor intensive, we brought inside and we automated a lot of that. And so I'll give you an example. That sensor I showed you for the IV, the version we sell now, this little piece, we make these adhesives that go on the bottom for about 35 cents. If I outsourced them, the cheapest we could get was
whoa,
$10.
okay, yeah,
And, and if in your medical devices, you typically have to have the floor is typically 4 to 5x. So if I got $5 in something, I got to charge 20 to $25 at a minimum because by the time you get through distribution and everybody takes their cut and the GPOs are taking their cut, there's not much left. So you got to be a margin hound. There's only two ways to do that. You can raise prices where you can decrease your cost of goods sold. And raising prices, as you know, is never popular, especially when you're trying to get launched in medical devices. You gotta be a margin
yeah.
hound. That's all there
Well,
is
let's
to it.
take a moment to talk about where you fall in the reimbursement landscape. Who is the economic buyer here, and how is it getting paid out?
So we don't have, we're not in the CMS or CPT stuff. We fall primarily under the
Okay,
DRG system because we focus on acute
okay,
care. So the reimbursement's covered just under the DRG
got it.
system. But, once we get into ambulatory surgery centers and various things and some of those reimbursement codes, and I will mention we sell a lot overseas now and completely different methodology. Some of them are doing DRGs now, but it used to be, you've been around med device to know that it used to be, let's go get our CE mark. We'll launch in Europe and then we'll come back to
Yeah,
the
it's not really
US.
the pathway anymore.
Well, Europe is no, it took us 7 years to get through EU MDR. We were one of the first to apply, but then you had TUV. They weren't trained on the audits yet, so the whole thing was it's just bureaucratic
Yeah.
backlog.
Wow.
The NHS in the UK, same way, used to launch there, but what we're finding, I mean, we started finding this out a couple years ago was, the emerging markets are actually seem to be easier to get into than the US, EU, or UK, things like Saudi Arabia, GCC, and they will publish. And so we have, hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about post-market stuff. But a lot of our publications are coming out of emerging markets now because it's so hard to get them in the
Yeah, well,
US.
I am hearing so much about the Middle Eastern market and opportunities
Yeah,
there because they really do have a sophisticated hospital system and buyer, and they don't have the sort of healthcare structure to deal with in the same way. And so there's a lot of different ways you can see opportunity in the Middle East. Why don't we get into the post market? What's
sure.
our big takeaway there?
Well, what it took to get through the FDA is not what it takes to get into a
Right?
hospital.
Absolutely.
I just can't emphasize that. Every entrepreneur I talk to in healthcare, they're like, "Oh, I got these sample size of 20, and surely that'll work in the hospital." And IV Watch finally this last year had multi-year study with 30,000 patients in a cohort, and it came out of Qatar, out of the
Oh,
Middle
there you
East.
go. Yeah, 30,000 right out of
And,
Qatar. Wow.
yeah, so, those are the numbers you need, though, to get reimbursement and US and all of that stuff. You don't need 20 or 100, then nobody everybody will laugh at that. You gotta get up in the thousands. In fact, there was somebody that does the ultrasound project, they're at UVA, and, she said, "We're lying to our investors if we're not, making them prepared that these post-market surveys or studies are incredibly expensive. They're almost as expensive as developing the
Yeah.
device, and you gotta have
So
that."
explain to the viewer what the value is of the post-market study and what you use it for.
Everywhere you go in a hospital, we have a novel device. We're the only IV Watch is the only device that can detect IVs going bad. And so, evidence-based medicine is just a phrase everybody uses. And so everybody wants to see the evidence. And without the evidence, a lot of times you'll just get shut out. Sometimes you get shut out because your evidence came from overseas. There's another study going on in Australia right now for IV Watch. The government gave them as 1.4 or $1.8 million to do a multi-year study with 3
Mhm.
hospitals. Those are the kind of things, and they take time, unfortunately. You get your FDA clearance, you go, I'm all ready to sell. And then you go into your first account and they're going, show me the evidence. And you're going, here's my N of 20.
Yeah. Yeah, or you make a model that assumes based on some bigger, economic study. So that's interesting. So you went to the Middle East to basically make the case that what you were assuming would be able to avoid certain complications and alert you to it, that it actually played out in the real world and there were the cost savings and the clinical saving or outcomes that you were aiming for.
Yeah. And so we started in Qatar. Believe it or not, that guy, his name's Roland Van Rens. He actually found IV Watch in a poster session too. I'm starting to think these poster sessions might be the way to
Hey,
go.
there you go.
But yeah, he was over at a conference in the US. They had a huge problem in their neonatology area in the NICU. And so we ended up flying over there and they did a trial and then they ended up implementing it. And so has all this incredible data from the WWRC over there. People don't realize, they think, oh my gosh, the Middle East, what terrible
Right.
hospitals. They got really good
Yeah.
hospitals over there.
Yeah.
Yeah. We actually have, IV Watch, we actually have somebody full time, a clinician in United Arab Emirates.
Okay. Nice.
But yeah, and even at Virginia Bio on the board, a lot of the med device companies, a lot of them are really starting to focus on the Middle
Yeah.
East.
Yeah. And that's why we're starting to see some conferences there, like MedTech World
Yeah,
has
Arab
started to
Health,
do Bio One, and there's another big one that I'm blanking on.
Arab Health
Yeah,
probably.
Arab Health. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, they kind of took over from Medica.
Okay. We're seeing things
I
shift
used to
in the
go to
world
Medica.
of med tech conferences right now. I think it's an interesting time. So, one of your big takeaways was to stay off the phone and travel.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that because I think, especially now, I mean, I'm from an older generation, no offense, but I think you're at a slightly older generation than I am. And, it used to be that you let your fingers do the walking. And I don't think anybody younger than 40 has ever heard that. And now everybody just wants to sit back and throw everything into ChatGPT and do Zoom conferences. So, is this something applicable in today's age, and how do you translate that?
You know what? That's like my number one trigger is people that don't get out in the field. I mean, I came back from the JP Morgan conference a few weeks ago and I stopped at Cincinnati and a good friend of mine that I've formed a relationship with over the last 14 years, I just shadowed him for the
Nice.
day. It was fascinating. And seeing other people come in and pitch their goods and seeing how he gets cases and all that. And it was just
Yeah.
fascinating. And people don't do that anymore. They get on the phone and they go, you want to buy my stuff? You wanna buy my stuff? You wanna buy my stuff? And you can't do that. You gotta get out there, and I'm not talking about a fake relationship. You gotta get out there, have genuine relationships with these people, and that's not just healthcare, that's like every industry. So, you're right, I'm a little older than you. They used to bring over a box of plane tickets in one of the first startups I did after I left NASA every Monday morning, and we would hand them out. because what are you doing sitting in here? And then all of a sudden Teams and Zoom and all that came along, and it's just I don't like it. You gotta be in the room. You gotta read the room. You gotta go out, I pay these people, go play golf, go do something, go flying in their airplane, go do
Yeah.
something, be their friend. And, that's one of my pet peeves is people that don't get out in the field, because how many I even posted this on LinkedIn the other day. How many people that are on boards or executives in companies, and they've never been in a hospital or it's been 20 years? That's
That
just
is
crazy.
crazy to me. I came from being an engineer into product development, into product management. That was like my career progression. And I used to and still do just eat up any opportunity to get out into the hospital, be in a surgery, be experiencing what that's like. Even if it's just a cadaver lab, I will suck it up for that too. So, because it just opens your eyes to a lot of what's going on beyond what
Yeah,
you have going on. But you're right on the also on the relationship generation side. It's very hard. I will say I've made friends with you, Gary, and I've never met you face to face, but it is different when you get face to face with people.
it is. And if anybody remembers anything from this podcast, get out of the office, get out of your chair, and go visit your
Yeah,
customers,
that's a great one.
period.
I like it. Gary, tell us
Okay.
where your company has grown to since launch. What year did you launch and what are things looking like now?
So the product launched in
Okay.
2016. Now it's kind of our first generation, just a few hospitals. We came out with a low cost disposable 2020 during the pandemic. And we've been placed, on about 350,000 patients. So that's how I measure success is, you know, how much is it being reused in a particular hospital or department? If it's being reused a lot, it's successful.
Someone else said that was, one of the things they like to see is sort of that now I'm blanking on the term. It was like velocity of uptake, like how much are they growing? If only I could be more
It's
eloquent.
not always revenue either. I will tell you, it's not always revenue that you can measure, because our first sensor that we came out with was $160, but I only had a margin on it of like $20. It was terrible. The new sensor is like $35, but I get a 70% margin on it. So, the revenue when we launch that, the revenue goes down, but the number of sensors being used, number of patient encounters is growing rapidly, and that's the metric you gotta
Yeah.
use. How fast are you growing? How much is it being used, and how is that increasing?
So one of your takeaways was work from the clinical level upwards. What do you mean by that?
Well, you do have to work from the top down, bottom up. You gotta get through value analysis, and, everybody's got a veto right? It all ends at the clinician if they sabotage
Mm.
you. And, my son is a doctor, and he says new technologies and new products die on the midnight
Oh,
shift
that's a good point.
because yeah, because people don't, the clinicians say, "I'm not using it." And if you're asking them to do a little extra work and they don't have to, they're not gonna do it. And so, I think that's just an important point is you gotta have the person using it that your device or your technology is their best friend, and when they're gonna give an IV, they're gonna run and grab your device without somebody beating them over the head saying you have to
Well, and
use
let's
this.
drill into that a little bit because, here you are going into a hospital department. How do you've made an argument to the hospital to try it out, but how do you train up and convey to everyone who's going to be on all the shifts why they should be using it and really instill that in them so that they want to use it?
Well, we have a training programs, and, we have super users, and so, we go through and we'll try to scrub out who your friends are, who are your champions. And again, you just try to get that motivation going. And then we send in a clinical team all the time to make sure that, because there's such turnover in clinical
Yeah.
staff, you got to keep going back and keep going back and keep going back. If you don't do that, it'll die in the closet. Somebody gave me a great quote the other day. They said medical devices are like bread machines. Everybody has one, but they're in the
Yes.
closet.
Bread machines are a very good analogy for that. I had one too. I think I used it once and then I gave it to my mom.
And it made great bread,
Yeah, and then
probably,
she
right?
used it for a couple of months, and then she gave it to my sister, so it's been making the rounds around the family. Contracts with Vizient and Premier and nope.
Newco.
So, what's the big takeaway?
You don't know who
No?
Newco is? So, you know what GPOs
Yes.
are, right? So, I think that the audience probably does, group purchasing organizations. And, so the 2 big ones in the US, there's probably 3. There's the HCA related one, but the 2 big ones everybody uses are Vizient and Premier. Now, you really have to be on those, and they have programs. We got in through Breakthrough Technology Awards, and that way you can get on those contracts. Because the way hospital buying works is a certain percentage of their operational budget has to go through that GPO. So they're very protective over the part that doesn't, that they have left, and so if you're on the contract, you get you're part of the, "I can spend money over here and not get in
Tell
trouble."
me how the breakthrough device this was the FDA breakthrough device designation?
No, 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 this is Vizient and Premier have these programs for young technology, health technology companies to come in, present to a board, and they go, "Yeah, we don't have this on our catalog." And I mean, they're not going to let you come in with a new pulse oximeter, but something like an IV watch or some new technology, they'll let you in for I think it was 2 years, 3 years, and then you can renew it, and then hopefully you get put on the regular
Got it.
contracts. But those buying contracts are great because then you don't have to go to every hospital and negotiate a contract separately, which will eat up all of your eat up all your budget with legal
Yeah.
fees. And you got just one master contract you can work
Well,
off
that's very
of.
interesting. I did not know about these breakthrough designations for the GPOs. And
Yeah.
so I'm assuming it's probably not the same exact rules for each of them, but it's easy to look up and check out.
Well, yeah, when one gives it to one, we got it with Vizient and Premier, like, 30 days later, all of a sudden we had it over here already.
Okay.
So they monitor each
Got
other.
it. Got it. Okay. Here, we give everybody the same questions on this. Okay, you ready? What's one thing that you would recommend to other companies you always for sure would do it again in order to see commercial success with your company?
As I said earlier, I'd get a deep partner from the very beginning, from day one.
And a more clinical one than a study focused one, you think, or just more
Yeah.
invested in general?
Yeah, I have a half a dozen things I would
Right? All the
that are
takeaways,
number
right?
1.
Okay, what's one thing
No, but that's a big one. I think, like, Cincinnati Children's really made IV Watch, and having that deep partner that allowed
Mhm.
access.
Okay, and what is one thing you would never do again? What is a hard lesson you want or learned?
Well, I learned this lesson multiple times. Never ever hire a sales leader from a big sales
Interesting.
company.
Why is that?
It's a very different animal.
Because they have a reputation behind them already. They already have contracts with the hospitals. I think you could hire, well, not to disagree with you, but I feel like you could hire someone from a bigger company if they had been working pretty heavily on growing a market or doing strategic partnerships or something for that company. But if they came from a pretty tried and true area and they just had to sort of maintain their territory, that's a little different.
I agree with that, but I've made that latter mistake twice.
Okay. Don't do it again. Okay.
Don't do that again. No, you gotta, you know what? I've worked in big companies. I was senior vice president at a public company. I worked in the government, and you got to hire people based on where you are. When I'm CEO of a small company, I'm the guy literally cleaning toilets sometimes. I tell you, I wasn't doing that when I worked at
Right.
Symantec.
Yeah.
So it's just what people call them doers and pointers. People that point their finger and other people that actually do it. You gotta hire
Yeah, and
doers.
I think that's a really good rule for startups in general is
Yeah,
sometimes, you can find someone that doesn't have the right experience, but as long as they're a go-getter and they're a problem solver, they're a very valuable member of your team. Okay.
absolutely. I
What
agree with
is
that
your
100%.
favorite KPI when it comes to revenue generation, commercialization?
Reuse, as I mentioned earlier. You have to find a way to measure. We do it by how many sensors did you sell this quarter? but reuse. If it's going in the closet with a bread maker, you're in
Got it.
trouble.
All right. And what has been your best unexpected growth lever in this process?
Just unexpected. And I expected
You
everything.
did. You were able to predict all of it.
Unexpected growth lever. I would say it would be the emerging
Okay.
markets and how important they've
Yeah.
become. That's contributing to a lot of growth for a lot of med device companies
Very
now.
cool.
It's not necessarily the US or the EU or the UK.
Yeah.
It's Vietnam, it's Australia, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Qatar,
Yeah.
UAE.
Okay. Good deal. Well, Gary, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It's been really great having you here, and we'll see what links we can provide from the topics of discussion to share in the show notes after this. I thank you all for joining the Device Files Commercialization Confidential. It is part of my Substack publication where I dive deeper into medical device and wearable commercialization strategy. You can subscribe at my name, blythekarow.substack.com, for more stories and analysis. So I'm Blythe Karow. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next episode.